Hey everyone, my name is Tim Cadlick, and today I wanted to show you a recently disclosed high-severity XML external entity, XXE for short, vulnerability that was discovered in the Nokogiri library. Now, for those not familiar, Nokogiri is a very popular library that's used to parse and extract data from XML, SAX, reader, or HTML documents. To do this, it pulls in libraries like libxml2 and libxslt to allow users to parse the documents using XPath or even CSS3 selectors. It's a very powerful, very user-friendly library, but unfortunately some issues in libxml2 trickle up and leave Nokogiri potentially vulnerable to an XXE attack. So to show this vulnerability, I have a very short Ruby script. We are importing the Nokogiri library, and then we open up a file, in this case internal.txt, and we're going to parse the contents of that file as XML. And we're going to do that for now using the default configuration options. Then we're going to output the generated XML to the terminal, and if there are any errors, we'll output those to the terminal as well. Now, internal.txt is a fairly simple XML document that's using something called an internal entity. Think of this as a variable. We're defining an entity called post. We give it a value of test, and then later on in the script, we refer back to our post entity, and it's going to swap the value in. So if we run this, using the default options, we'll see that the XML is generated and outputted as a terminal, but you'll notice that the value of the entity hasn't been swapped in. That's because in the latest versions of the library, we have to specifically say that we want entity substitution enabled. So if we go back and we enable that using config.noent and rerun our script, you'll see that the value of the entity has now been swapped into place as we would expect. So that's an internal entity, but we could also use external entities. So if we look at external.txt, again, it's a fairly short XML document. But what we have here is we're defining another entity named bad because we like to be obvious here. And we're passing it a URL. And then what should happen is the XML should be parsed. It should make a request out to this resource, and the contents of that file would then be swapped in for bad later on when we use it. Now, if we run this script as is in the terminal, it's actually going to fail. And that is because in the latest versions of Nokogiri, they've turned off network connections for external entities by default. I'll explain why that's such a good idea in just a minute. So in the latest versions, we have to opt into it. To do that, we use two options. The DTD load option, which says to load any document type definitions that are referenced. And then we need to tell Nokogiri that it's okay to make a network connection to a remote URL. And to do that, we use the no-no-net property. It's a little awkwardly named. The default is no-net, which is set to true, which means that there is no network connection. So to flip that, we have to say no-no-net. I know, but it works. So at this point, we've told Nokogiri we want entity substitution, we want any document type definitions that are referenced to be loaded in, and it is okay to make network requests for an external URL. So now if we rerun our script, you'll see that it made a request out to this file, it got the contents, and then it spit the contents out later in the XML document. Now this is a really big security issue. If the user is in any way able to manipulate or provide the input that gets parsed as XML, they could potentially leak confidential information or even conduct a denial of service attack, say by providing an obnoxiously sized document or a document that recursively includes different entities. If anybody's familiar with the billion laughs attack, that was the basic idea. It was this document that had an entity that referred to an entity that referred to an entity and so on, that could end up being used as a denial of service. Now, at first glance, it seems that we're relatively safe here. In the latest versions of the library, we actually have to opt in to all three options to enable external entities to be requested and pulled in. So, for example, if we were to turn off entity substitution and rerun it, you'll see that the value doesn't actually get swapped back into our document. So it seems fairly safe, but this wasn't always the case. In versions of Nokogiri prior to 1.5.4, Nokogiri was set to load in external entities by default. So if you're running a later or an earlier version of the library, even if you did not tell it explicitly that you wanted to load document type definitions or allowed network connections, it would still make requests for external entities. As of version 1.5.4, they changed the default settings so that you're not vulnerable by default. However, there's still a problem if you're using what's called parameter entities. So let's look at an example of that. So parameter entities, parameter external entities, are fairly similar. They use a slightly different syntax. You'll see here that it's referenced using a percentage symbol instead of an ampersand. But other than that, we're defining an entity called remote, and it is coming from this source, bad.dtd, and then we reference it here. Now, the other thing to keep in mind with parameter entities is that they can only be used exclusively within document type definitions. I couldn't reference this entity down here within the root element, for example. So if I have, again, all three options enabled, and I run the script, again, it makes a request out to this external source, grabs the value, and then spits that into our document as we've said to do. However, if we were to turn off entity expansion, you'll see that it actually still goes through the entire process, even though we've explicitly stated we don't want any entities to be expanded. This is due to a bug inside of libxml2 that allows entity expansion of parameter entities even when we've specifically said not to expand them. So potentially we're vulnerable to external entities that could still be swapped in, that could still be used as a denial of service attack. So to protect yourself from this sort of issue, there are a couple things you need to do. The first is make sure that you're including version 1.54 or later of Nokogiri. If you're using an older version than that, you're vulnerable by default. You can use Sneak to check against your project and see if that's the case, and then upgrade to a later version of the library. If you are using version 1.5.4 or greater, then you want to check your configuration options. Specifically, you want to make sure that you haven't opted into document type definition loading and network connections. Again, it's worth noting both of these options need to be set for this vulnerability to be exposed. So again, ensuring you're not vulnerable today is a two-step process. First, make sure you're on the latest version of the Nokogiri library. And secondly, check your configuration options. And that's going to be the best you can do to protect yourself today. Later on, when a more resilient fix gets implemented and then added into the Nokogiri library, you could be alerted to that upgrade or that patch if you use Sneak to monitor your project. In which case, when an official fix becomes available, we can alert via Slack or email, for example, so that you can at that point upgrade to a much safer version of Nokogiri. Thanks for watching and stay secure.